Welcome everybody to our March MTPD. The MTPD is a series of master teacher led presentations where master teachers get a chance to share their passions with their peers. We are incredibly excited today to have Kenneth Jones. Kenneth Jones is a master teacher at UTeach Columbus in Georgia. He has a master's degree in mathematics education from Auburn University, taught 7th through 12 math for 10 years at, you're gonna have to help me with this one, Notasulga?
Notasulga, you did pretty good.
High School, a rural K through 12 school in Macomb County, Alabama. He worked for 3 years as a secondary resource teacher as part of an Algebra for All grant at the Columbus Regional Mathematics Collaborative. He taught math for 9 years at Troke County High School in LaGrange, Georgia. And he then served as the director of the Columbus Regional Mathematics Collaborative for 7 years, from 2005 to 2012. Since 2012, he has been a master teacher with UTeach Columbus, teaching Step 1, Step 2, Functions and Modeling, the Apprentice Teaching Seminar, and the one you're all here for to learn more about Step 3. And he has presented at a variety of mathematics professional developments for teachers throughout the country and is trained as a presenter for Population Connection. Today, we're going to hear all about his presentation on developing pedagogical and technological content knowledge through a Step 3 course. So I am thrilled to introduce Kenneth Jones, and when you are ready, you can take it away.
Okay, thank you. I guess I should have thought about the fact that all of these people were coming to my office and cleaned up, but I mean, I guess the people that work with me have to put up with the mess. So y'all just forgive the mess in the back too. So our computers aren't fast enough to do the fake background that covers up everything. So I'm delighted to be able to share with you. And so I'm going to try to share my screen. So if somebody give me a thumbs up if you're seeing my screen. All right, good. All right. We've been back in person for since fall of 2020, I guess. So I'm kind of out of the practice of all this the online thing. So, but I always tell my students, you know, if you can't see, if I'm not sharing the right thing or I'm talking about something and you're not seeing it, just unmute yourself and tell me. So and so feel free to do that today. So. It's a pleasure for me to be able to share with you what we've done here at Columbus State with developing a Step 3 class. And so I thought what I would do today is kind of give you an overview of the why behind the course, why we decided to develop the Step 3 class. Spend most of the time giving you a description of the course and some of the assignments and activities that we include in the course, and hopefully leave some time for questions at the end. The why kind of came from, so we're in our 10th year, we're celebrating our 10th year anniversary. And so we started this, the first time we taught it was in the fall of 2019. So we've been teaching it for the last 3 years. And so we had been going long enough that some of our people had started to graduate. And so we had started, you know, we'd had a number of apprentice teachers. And we began to realize that that we wished, or as I taught Step 1 and Step 2 even, that we wished that there was more time for the students to learn about some of the specific technologies. What I noticed was that in my Step 1 and Step 2 class, we always tried to include technology in the Step 2 class, but what technology a student learned about depended on what their lesson was that they taught. So I would have some Step 2 students, for example, they would know about Desmos because one of their lessons, I mean, that I helped them write used Desmos, or some of them would learn about PhET, but not everybody was exposed to and had learned to use those technologies. And so we realized that there were some basic technologies that all the students weren't being able to expose to. And just some things like some of the things with cooperative learning and just some of the general teaching pedagogies, we realized that, you know, in Step 1, Step 2, CI and PBI, there are a lot of those things that you have times to touch on, but we don't have time to really dig deeper into. And so we thought we wished that we could have a course where we could spend more time introducing students to some of the specific general technologies, as well as some of the content specific technologies. The other thing that we realized is, so the class historical perspectives of mathematics and science, I think that's what all the UTeach programs call it. Here, the decision was made, that's not a UTeach class, it's an ITDS interdisciplinary class. And so, I mean, our UTeach students were taking that class, but it wasn't just for UTeach students. And so it was taught by a philosopher. Quite frankly, it wasn't the most engaging and exciting class in the manner in which it was taught, because it wasn't taught by somebody who had an education background. And I think the person was having them do the assignment that was developed by UTeach Austin initially, where they write a lesson plan incorporating it. But because that was an ITDS class, the students could take it at any time. So sometimes they hadn't even had step one. And so they're trying to write a 5E lesson when they haven't even been exposed to that. The person who teaches the class really doesn't know anything about 5E lessons. So our students really, for the most part, did not feel like they were getting a lot out of that class. And so that's how we made the room for step three. Is we made step three, and we just chose to call it step three. We made it a general elective that they could take basically any time after they've taken step two. And so they have a choice to either take the ITDS historical perspectives of math and science class, or they can take step three. And so that's how we were able to make room for it in the program. And the truth is, the majority of them choose to take the step three class. Sometimes if it just doesn't fit in their schedule, they'll take the ITDS class. And so we called it step three. We gave it a 2000 number so that students could basically take it at any time after they've taken step two. We've even allowed students to take it as a co-requisite with step two. And so it really doesn't assume a whole lot of prior content knowledge. And so we developed it as a 3-hour class. And so they, like I say, they can either take the ITDS historical perspectives class, or they can take step three in their program. So it doesn't add any additional time to the program. And so that's kind of our fancy description of the class that we had to use to get it approved through the curriculum committees and all of those kinds of things. And so in some ways, step three is a misnomer, because it's not necessarily the third class that they take. Some people take step one, step two, CI and PBI. So we've had people take it at the same time they're taking PBI, or after they've taken PBI before they student taught. We have some people that are taking it at the same time they've taken CI. We've had some people that are taking it at the same time they're taking step two or whatever. So the step three can be a little bit misleading, but that was just the way we chose to describe it in UTeach vernacular, so that our students kind of understood it. And so that's kind of the how the course came to be. And I guess the way I came to teach the class is, we're a small program. I'm the only full-time master teacher. There's one part-time science master teacher, and then the co-directors that work, part-time for UTeach and part-time in the College of Letters and Science and College of Education, and that's it. So I guess that's kind of how I drew the straw to teach it. But also, it was a particular interest of mine. So again, this is kind of, and I would be glad to share with anybody if anybody wants to. This was kind of our the definition of the course objectives that we had to create for the curriculum committee and all of those things to get it approved. What I actually do in the class kind of varies from semester to semester. I try to make it very practical and meet the needs of the students. And I mean, we do all of those objectives, but if somebody were to come and look, they might not think we did them quite with the fidelity that they might interpret some of those fancy curriculum statements. But basically our goal is to get the students to learn more about technology, to have a little bit more time to look at the standards across grade levels. Tends to be when they're in step 1, step 2, CI and PBI, they're looking at the standards for the particular grade level that they're teaching, but they don't have a whole lot of opportunities to look at the standards as a whole across grade levels. And so we try to do some of that in step 3. It gives us a chance to do a little bit more with the mathematical practices and the science and engineering practices. It gives us a little bit more opportunity to think about some of the specific content pedagogies and so forth. And so I thought I would share some of the sample activities and assignments that we do in the class, and then hopefully leave time for questions from other people. We start the class usually the first day. We use Flipgrid, introduce Flipgrid in Padlet. And the way I do that is I have students try to think about what are the characteristics that makes a great teacher. And my goal is kind of to get to them thinking about what makes somebody not just a good teacher, but a great teacher. And my hope is that they come up with some of the characteristics and skills and things that eventually we're going to be talking about in this class. And so I usually have them start with the Padlet and go on the Padlet and list characteristics of great teachers. And then I have them create a Flipgrid video. One of the years, I think this was 2 years ago, I had them in groups do the Flipgrid. This past year, I believe the very first day that the class was supposed to meet, there was bad weather, and it was when there was bad weather in Columbus. And so the day before the first day of class, we found out we were going online. And so I had to adapt the assignment so that they could do the Flipgrid and stuff from home to generate the characteristics of good teachers. But I thought I'd share, this is one of the short little Flipgrid videos that one of the groups did one year. Hopefully this plays.
Hey everybody, here are some of the things you need to be a super teacher.
Professionalism. Be your student's teacher, not their best friend.
Be knowledgeable on your subject so that you can help them understand anything they don't understand.
Hashtag learning styles.
And you have to exhibit compassion, justice, mercy, and those under the umbrella of being a empathetic teacher.
So I think that assignment, I gave them these. I like going to the dollar store. That's one of my favorite stores. And I think I had a set of those little props for like a party for taking pictures. And so they had to incorporate, those props into their video. Part of my goal is for them to start to think about being creative people. Is that to be a great teacher, you need to be able to think outside the box and think about how could I use some of these tools to do something different than maybe exactly what they were designed to do. So that was the way we used Flipgrid. They had used, before they created the video, they used Padlet to generate some of the characteristics of great teachers. And so once they've been exposed to Padlet, then I created an assignment where that throughout the semester, they have to create their own Padlet account, and they have to create a Padlet that is their teacher toolbox. And so I wanted them to have a place where they could record or keep up with all of the tools, all the websites, all of the places that they're learning about. I think the first time I taught the class, I don't think I did that. And then what would happen is they would get the student teaching and they would say, Mr. Jones, do you remember that thing that we did? Can you send me that link or whatever? And so I decided to kind of put the onus on them is to have a place that they were accountable for keeping up with things. And I've heard from some of the students who have been student teaching that they still go back to their Padlet looking for what was that website or what was that activity. So I think once they started creating their Padlet, they learned to use that as a repository for storing good teaching tools. And so that's an actually graded assignment that they turn in at the end of the semester. They're just responsible for keeping up with it and updating it during the semester. And so you can see an example of the kinds of things that they did, that they recorded, so that they could get back to things. So because sometimes I just bookmark things. A lot of times I bookmark things in my web browser, and then sometimes I don't remember what it was or why did I save that. So the Padlet, I think, was good for them in terms of organizing the information so that they knew what it was. And that was one student. Somebody else did the Padlet a little bit differently, where they downloaded all of the links and stuff. So I think that was one of the things that the students found beneficial from the class, is beginning to develop that, what we call teacher toolbox, so that they had a way to document those things. One of the second activities that we do that I really have multiple goals for is, I call it Snotty Plots. And so it's an activity that comes from Science Friday that I got at some science workshop that I went to. And it's the task is, there's a video on the Science Friday that we use in the Engage. I won't play that for you, but it shows a sneeze. And so the task that we talk about is, if you were sitting at a table and somebody sneezed, where would be the safe zone to have your phone? And so they go through, and I use it because in step 1 and step 2, the only 5E lessons they've seen are lessons that can be completed in one day. And so for a lot of them, this is the first time to see a lesson or an investigation that expands multiple days. So we start with the video as the Engage. Then they end up spreading out, paper on the tables, having to come up with a way to simulate and model a sneeze. We've got, spray bottles, we've got pipettes, various things. And so they have to come up with a way to create an experiment to model the sneeze, look at where the droplets go, decide what kind. It's a very open-ended kind of thing, because they have to decide what kind of data do I want to create. So some of them count droplets, some of them measure how far the furthest droplet goes. And so I use that as an opportunity to introduce them to the idea of a multiple day 5E lesson. Is that some days, the first day, pretty much all we do is the Engage, and they spend the rest of the period doing the Explore, collecting the data. And then we talk about how you come back to that on a second day. So that's a good opportunity for them to see that. But then I also use it, I think I used it one year to have them think about, okay, if you did this with students in the class, how could you have each group share their results in some way other than everybody just standing up in front of the class and presenting? And so we talked about how we could use it with Flipgrid. And so one year the assignment was to quickly create a Flipgrid that explains the results of their experiment. This is one group doing that.
So our hypothesis was that the closer the phone was to the spray bottle or the turkey baster or whatever, the source of the sneeze, that it would be less effective. So we thought that A would be the least affected, B would be somewhat affected, C would definitely be affected, and D would be not affected. But we were wrong.
So for our experimental design, we laid out paper to protect the table, of course, and to see our results. And we used both a spray bottle and a turkey baster at the approximate heights of a person's face. And we used our sample snot made of starch, cornstarch, paint, glue, and also diaper filler material.
So in our experiment, we discovered that anything that was 7 inches or closer was safe. From 7 to a foot and 4 inches was comfortably safe. And anything from a foot and 4 inches going back to 6 feet was unsafe.
So
So the conclusion we came up with is if your friend has a cold or anything, put the phone right under their face or halfway across the room, and you'll be in the safe zone. Anyway, between that, you'll be in the danger zone.
So our hypothesis was.
So part of what I wanted was them to think about, so if you had all these, so I think what they did is they created the flip grids and then they shared their flip grids and then they had to go comment on other people's flip grids. And part of my goal was for them to see that, in class, if you do this with students, you don't have to have everybody spend a whole period having everybody report the results, that you could use Flipgrid to have people create a Flipgrid reporting the results. And then part of homework is to go home and comment and view on other people's Flipgrid. So I was trying to think of, what can you do so that, in your classroom, you don't have to listen to 6 groups present the same results over and over, that Flipgrid was a tool to do that. I think the next year I used it as an opportunity to have them learn to create a website, because I felt like that's a skill that teachers need when they get out in the classroom, is how do you create a website, or how could you use creating a website to have your students create a website. And so I had them create Google sites. So here's just a quick example of, I think my assignment was, they had to create a website where they shared what some of the essential big questions were, what was their hypothesis, what were the materials, how did they conduct the experiment, upload some pictures, upload the data. The idea is what I wanted them to understand is, if you were having high school students do this project, what kind of things would you want high school students to be able to put on your website? And my other goal was I just wanted them to know basically how to create a website in Google Sites. And so, my goal was a lot of times in the activities that we do, I have partly a content goal, but sometimes a goal for them as a future teacher. So I wanted them to see how they could have students use a website to report results of an investigation as an open-ended project, but I also wanted them to know actually how to create websites. It took me a little while to realize that even though these are young students who, what I call, are technology natives that grew up with technology, that doesn't mean that they always know how to use all of the tools that people like me who are older have kind of learned to use, but and so that they needed some opportunity just to learn how to use and how to create a website. So that was part of the goal. I think one of the other things I did with that assignment is then we learned to use a tool called, I think we used Rubistar, but I wanted them to think about how do you create rubrics for things. So then after you've done this experiment, after you've done this activity, you've created a website, if you were the teacher, how would you then evaluate the students? How would you create a rubric to evaluate that? And so we looked at a couple of rubric creating sites. And so then they had to go back and create a rubric that they would use to assess their project, so that they were learning to use the rubric. So even though this takes several days, it models both a couple of like a 2-day 5E lesson. In the process, they're learning to create a website. Eventually they learn to create a rubric. So they're learning some of those teaching skills that they need to be able to do later on. One of the assignments that we did one year was we did something called a Pedagogical. And some of you have probably seen these. Sometimes they're called Pedagogicals. Specifically is a 20 images, 20 seconds per image. So it's a PowerPoint where you have 20 slides that are timed to go 20 seconds a piece. Some I've seen other places where it's called an Ignite talk at some conferences and stuff. And my goal was for the students to do this themselves. And I think one of the things that was a misconception is I wasn't suggesting this as a method for the teacher to present content, because it's not a very good way for the teacher to present content. But I saw it as a good way if you were teaching a group of high school students, instead of saying, here's a research project to do and everybody go do a boring PowerPoint, in order to do the Pedagogical type thing where it's slides, you try to use visuals instead of just a bunch of words on the slides. You really have to think about what's the right image. What are the few words that you can put on the slide? You've got to really think about what you're going to say. So I was proposing this as an idea that if you were teaching a high school class where they were doing some kind of research, where the student task could be to have to do a presentation in this specific format where the slides are timed. You can't just wing it. You've got to think, you've got to rehearse, you've got to carefully come up with your script. And I think my students, I think they weren't far enough along to get that. I mean, this is probably a project that would be better done when they're in student teaching, because a lot of these were step 1 and step 2 students. They weren't soon going to have the opportunity to be in a classroom where the students were going to be working on something for 2 or 3 days and presenting a project. I still think it's a good idea. Just at the point the students were in step 3, they took it as a presentation tool for them as the teacher, and not a presentation tool for their students to use. So I haven't done it since the first year, but I think I'm going to incorporate it into the student teaching seminar. One of the other things that I had them do is they had to create a weekly journal. I wanted them to learn how to create a blog. And the first year I taught the course, I think I had a science person who was co-teaching with me, and she was familiar with this, with Blogspot. And so it's a free tool. And so I had each one of the students create a blog. And so they had to keep up with a weekly journal where they summarize some of the things that we've done in class. Because again, I wanted them to have a record. And I wanted them to learn 2 things. That they could have their students do blogs, that's a beneficial way to kind of have students do journaling. And so I wanted them to know how to use the Blogspot tool, but I also wanted them to have a repository where they could keep up with, and reflect on the things that they were learning in the class. So it had both kind of, a dual purpose. And so just each week they had to go in and write just a short blog about what we had done that week, what they thought about it. And it was useful to me, kind of like student journals. I had about 15 students in the class every time I've taught it, but it's beneficial for me to go in and read their blogs and to find out, what are the things that they get and what are the things that they don't get. And actually it was from reading the blogs that I found out, oh, they didn't get what I wanted them to get out of that Pedagogical activity, that they didn't understand it the way I wanted. So, and several of them, at least a couple of students, when they student taught, had their students do blogs, particularly the year when they were student teaching, I think here in fall 2020 and spring the second year of the pandemic, wherever that was. When schools went back in person, some kids were in person, some kids were online. And I know one of our science people had the students do blogs in his high school science classroom. So I know that that's a tool that they've used. Another thing that we do in the class is they learn to create a breakout room, and I had to start changing the title of that. I used to call it breakout rooms until Zoom came along and had to be specific and say, no, we're talking about an escape room. So have them design a classroom escape room. And we talked about the benefits of those and using those. And so I taught them how to actually create an escape room. They worked in teams, and so they had to submit, basically pick a content standard to create the room using. They had to identify the standard that it covered. They had to identify the learning objectives. They had to create their own locks and puzzles and tools. And then they had to create a backstory. So I'm going to see if I can share. Let me stop sharing this and see if I can share. So this is what, they could create them using Google Slides. And so it took a couple of days of class to show them how to use Google Slides and do this thing. So they could create one either that was in Google Slides, that used Google Slides and Google Forms for the locks, or they could create one that was a physical breakout room where there was hard copies of the puzzles and so forth. That was just up to them. And so this one is a Google Slides one. I think you get into it that way. And then you enter the challenge. It has some directions, and then you just click on the puzzles, and it takes them to a particular puzzle. And I think this one you have to match the number to the correct tombstone kind of thing. So so we spent a couple of days actually learning to do the tools to be able to create that in Google Slides. So again, in the process, they're learning how to create a teaching tool, and they're learning how to use Google Slides. Because it takes some pretty significant Google slide comes in, and that was one of my better students. That was one of the ones that was better, that the person really kind of overachieved. So some of them didn't always work quite as well as that. So they could either do the online version, or they could actually create puzzles where they were in a folder that would actually be spread around the room, and the students had to use that to break out. And so they learned some different sources and places that, how to take a worksheet, what I call a worksheet problem, and turn it into a task that where there's something more to do than just get the answer. You've got to do something with the answer. You got to figure out, translate the answer into Morse code or something, so that it involved a little bit higher order thinking. Another activity that I came up with, this was my effort in wanting them to be creative. There's one day I went to the Dollar Tree. Again, that's my favorite store, and I think it's the $1.25 tree or something. I think the prices have gone up. And I just looked and bought a whole bag of stuff. And what the task was is they draw an item, and you have to think of how does this item relate to math, science, or computer science? What are the questions that come out of this item? And so I think the one I use for an example is my dog waste bags. And we talk about, okay, so what in the world does this have to do with science? Well, why do we pick up dog waste? Well, because it's dirty. What is it that makes it dirty? What are the dangers of it being out there? The idea of parasites come up with. Okay, so what are parasites and how does that relate? So the idea was to kind of think outside the box of how does some simple item connect to math and science. And then they had to design an activity, not a lesson, but a short activity, and explain to the class, how would you use your item to introduce some math or science content? So I found the flea and ticks things, little toys that in math could be used for scale factor and stuff. Computer science, how does that cable work? And so they had to kind of think outside the box to begin to think about, there's math and science all around us, and doesn't just come out of the textbook. And if you're like schools around here, also, you don't have access to a lot of money to buy lots of props to come into class. So you need to learn to look when you go into the Dollar Tree and see some of these things and think about, oh, if I'm teaching a unit on parasites, oh, I could use some flea killer as the engage to hook into that unit or whatever. Or if I'm doing a math lesson, we can do scale factor, and we can figure out what size house would this furniture fit in, and so forth. So part of my goal was to get them to learn to think outside the box, and be creative, and to recognize and see math and science in the world all around them. So the object-based lesson, they had to think about, how could they connect it to a content standard? If they were going to use that item, would they use it for the engage activity? Is it possible to create an explore activity around it, like the doll furniture? That's a great math activity, is to measure it and then to figure out how tall would the person be. I mean, so some of them lend themselves to explore. Where would they use it in the lesson? And then they had to share those in the class. One of the things that our students have a difficult time with is the concept statement in the lesson plan. And so they had to think about, okay, what's the math and the science that's involved in this item? And so that one they enjoyed pretty much. We have 3D printers here. A few years ago when we first started with the grant, when we had lots of money, we had a person on staff who was really interested in 3D printing. And so we bought all these 3D printers, and then that person left and went somewhere else. And so we were left with these 3D printers that none of us really knew how to use. And they're sitting here with all this filament. And so the only class we could figure out to incorporate them into was step 3. And it's a tool that some of the schools have. And so I wanted them to have an opportunity to at least learn basically how to use the 3D printers. I don't know much about them. And so I incorporated a couple of projects where one of them was a computer coding project. That's the one on the left, where they had to go in and code the algorithm to create the object, and then you import it into another program, and it creates that, I guess you would call mandala type design. It renders it in 3D, and then they can print it out. And then the other one that you see over here, they had to go look on a website, and I gave them a list of websites that had items pre-designed, and just find something, a 3D model that could be used somewhere in their content area and print it out. So we didn't get into using CAD or whatever to design objects, partly because I don't know how to, and we don't have time to do all of that. But I wanted to know that the 3D printers were here and were available for them to use as their lessons. There's a lot of science stuff out there. You know, if you want, you can find the 3D files that'll print fossils and various things. So there's lots of different things, ways that they could use the 3D printer. So I just wanted them to make sure that they knew how to use them. We set them up in a room down here. This past year, the first year, they were housed over in computer science in another building, but we finally have them in our area down here. And so they learned to use the 3D printers. Another tool that I wanted them to use was a tool called Powtoon, which is a free tool for creating video. And the way I introduced that to them is I used this little video. So again, my goal is I want them to learn to use the tool, but I want them to think about, so how could you use this tool to introduce content to students? How could you use the tool to create an assignment? How could you use the tool to, I mean, now since most places, the schools around here, the students all have Chromebooks, so a lot of the teachers post things on their website. So I wanted them to learn to use the tool, but to think about, how could you use this free tool to create a short video that would introduce content to students that you could post on your website, or that could be used to introduce an assignment. So some of the other topics that we did, we learned to use Rubistar was one of them, and I think there are other couple of kind of free. Most of all the things we use are free because we don't have any money here. The grant's long gone. So if it's not free, we don't have it. But I wanted them to see that there's tools out there to help you create rubrics, because you don't have to create everything from scratch in Word, that there are places that you can go that'll get you started creating rubrics. We have a person, our other science master teacher, has been trained in the modeling curriculum that I think came out of Arizona. I mean, she was a physics teacher and she's done the physics modeling. So she comes in and spends a couple of days talking about modeling and using whiteboarding as a teaching technique, and teaches them how to do that. And after we did that, the students started checking out our whiteboards a lot and taking them out into the schools and their CI and PBI and student teaching lessons. We spend a couple of days learning to use the probes with either the TI-84 or the TI-Inspire, because again, this was a thing that we do a little bit of for the math people when they take functions in the modeling, but the science people weren't getting any experience in learning to use the probes and how to fit those in a lesson. Most of the schools around here have smartboard technology, and so we always introduce the students to the basics of smartboard in step one. In fact, their step one final project is they just have to show that they know how to, insert text, insert an object, and a few basic things. But there's no time in the courses for them to really learn to master the tools of smartboard. So we take a day or two in step three and actually explore some of the more advanced tools in the smartboard, so that they're more comfortable using the smartboards. There's a teaching tool out of Harvard called the question formulation technique, where that you can use in the classroom to generate questions. And so we spend one day doing a lesson where they learn the specifics of the question formulation technique. Actually, they've been exposed to it in step two. Because in step two, when we learn about characteristics of adolescence, I always start with a quote about adolescence. And the question formulation technique is you give a prompt and students have to generate as many questions as they can think of about that and write them down. And then they go through and pick out the most important questions. And it's a good technique to use in class as a engage for a unit, because most of the questions that the students are going to generate are then questions that are going to be covered in the lesson or whatever. So if you start with something about quadratics or whatever and have students generate every question you can possibly think about quadratics, out of those questions that they generate are probably the things that you're going to want to teach. And so the question formulation technique comes out of Harvard. And so that was a pedagogy that I wanted them to have. I felt like one of the things that's missing in step one and step two, and in our step one and step two, Janice or I pretty much tell the student, the teacher tells us what the standard is, and we go find an activity for them to do. And so they're given everything. But I wanted students to be exposed both to NSTA and NCTM, and to think about, okay, so how do I go look in those journals and find an activity? And then how do I adapt that activity into a 5E lesson? Because there's lots of great activities out there, but they're not published oftentimes in the journal as in a 5E inquiry-based thing. So we've done an assignment where they have to search through the journals, find an activity, and then think about how would I adapt that into a full-fledged 5E lesson. One of the things we never have enough time for in step one and step two, they learn a few cooperative learning tools in there, but there's always more to learn about cooperative learning. And so we try to take some time and do some additional cooperative learning techniques in step three. Then there's all kinds of technology that I decided, that's out there. I don't have the time to learn to be a master in all of these technological tools and then teach them to you. So one of the assignments is different groups are assigned some specific technology, like Quizlet Live, Jamboard, Nearpod, Pear Deck. I think there's a few others on the list too. Pixton is a cartoon creator. And so their group has to go out and go to the website, find the technology, figure out how does it work, and create an activity that could be incorporated in a lesson. Because the reality of being as a teacher is you can't always wait until somebody offers a professional development on the new tool that comes out to be able to incorporate it in your class. You have to know how to go find it, and you've got to be able to sit there and figure out how it works. And so that was a good experience for them to go learn to explore the technological tools and then to do a presentation on that. We spend a couple of days, and one of the things I like FET and I like gizmos from Explore Learning, and we've used, some of the students use those in some of their lessons in step 1 and step 2, but again, not everybody does, because there's not always one that fits their lesson. So I wanted to make sure that they were familiar with those tools as well as Desmos. And so we spend a day where they're just going out and investigating some specific FETs and evaluating them and thinking about how they could use them in the classroom. We tried to include a classroom observation component because they have limited opportunities to observe in step 1 and step 2. And depending on when they're taking step 3, sometimes it's a semester in between when they're not really going into schools. We're very limited in where we can place the students by the system that the College of Ed has set up for placing students. We only have certain schools that belong to the partner school network. So we don't have total freedom on where to send our students in step 1, step 2, CI, and PBI. And we realize that there's some teachers out there who do really good things. And sometimes they're not even math and science teachers. For example, there's some teachers that do a really good job of utilizing the one-on-one technology in their classroom. There's some teachers that do a really good job of co-teaching, where there's a special ed and a regular teacher in the classroom. There's some teachers who just are outstanding classroom managers or whatever, who have excellent classroom management. And so we tried to think of how can we get our students out into those classrooms seeing those things. And so we eventually got permission to be able to send students, not for a placement, but for these kind of one-time observations. And so I came up with a list. We identified the teachers, got permission from the teachers to come and the schools, and that was the whole bureaucratic process that took about half of the semester. But then, so the students just they didn't have to go see particular people, just off of that list. I think they're supposed to go see about one a week. So they were just supposed to make arrangements to go observe that classroom. So sometimes they're observing an elementary class where the teacher just really does a really good job of classroom management, or they may be observing an English teacher who made really good use of some particular technology. So it wasn't always a math and science person, because we were looking for them to see things that they might not see otherwise. So we did that in fall of 2019. Then the pandemic hit and schools were part online, part in person in the fall. And we didn't want people in the fall of 2020 going in and out of the schools. In fact, we didn't even go into the schools at all in step 1 and step 2 in 2020. So we didn't go anywhere in the fall of 2020. I did have them go on a limited basis this fall. So that's one of those things that needs some improvement, hopefully when the pandemic is over, is because we really want them to have more opportunities to see exemplary teachers. And sometimes there are exemplary teachers who aren't willing to give up the time to have a placement in their classroom, but they're willing for somebody to come in and sit in the back of the room and observe what they do. And so that was kind of the goal there. As teachers, the grading, we didn't do tests or anything. It was all, kind of like step 1, step 2, participation, lesson plans. I'll talk about that in a second. The observations and reflections. I just lumped together assignments. That's all those breakout rooms and all of those things that we did. And then the final project that also needs a little bit of work. But some of the areas that need improving is I haven't exactly figured out how to give them experience writing a lesson plan that they need more experience of when they aren't actually going to go out and teach it. I had some assignments where they did part of my goal, and so I opened for suggestions, is I want them to learn how to, because in step 1 and step 2, like I say, we kind of give them a framework to follow for writing the lesson plan. We tell them what the activities are. but I want to find a good way for them to go out. How do you go out and find somebody else's lesson plan that's not a 5E lesson plan, but adapt it and tweak it into a 5E lesson plan? I want to give them more experience in learning to find, resources or activities. So how do you look at a resource or activity and tweak it to make it fit somewhere into the 5E lesson plan? And the other thing that they're missing that they need more experience in is doing lessons that connect across multiple days, because when they get to student teaching, except for a 2-day lesson in CI and the 3-day lesson in PBI, I would really like to find a way to figure out how to fit more into where they're really looking at the standards and fitting things together. Another thing that's been deficient is computer science activities. One semester we had some computer science. Well, I think both times we taught it, we didn't have any computer science people the last time. The first time I had a computer science student, but I think he dropped halfway through. The second time we had a computer science student who wasn't willing to come in person and was only joining virtually, and then I think he dropped too. And I'm not a computer science person, and so I've learned a lot of science pedagogy, but so that's I guess a weakness is that we don't have a lot of computer science pedagogy except for the general pedagogies, and it's still difficult to be able to fit in some of the discipline specific pedagogies, because it's math people, science people, computer science people all together. And I found that it's difficult for students if you focus on something that's mostly science. The math students, because they haven't been in the classroom and had the experience, they're not able to really generalize and think about, okay, that's a science strategy, but I see how I could use it in math. They need it specifically, tailored to them. And so that's hard to do, and we haven't figured out a good way to do that. So I recognize that there's some weaknesses there. Really, we try to focus throughout all of the activities on the standards for mathematical practice and the science and engineering practices, so they see how those connect to the activities and how they need to fit those into the classroom, that those aren't things that you just teach one day as a standard, but those are things that fit with all of the lessons that you do. I try to be flexible, current, practical. So it changes every semester that we've taught it. It depends on what students are in the class that time. That semester, I don't always do exactly the same things. Students seem to like the class. The feedback from the class has been good. They seem to find the tools valuable and useful, and sometimes frequently I hear them talking about some of the things that they've used, because I also do the seminar when they do student teaching, and so I hear them talking about some of the tools that they use. I learn right along with the students that there's none of the technology am I expert in. Sometimes I'm going and figuring it out myself, and like all of you, sometimes, at least here at CSU, sometimes it works in my office. Sometimes when I go into the classroom, you pull up the site and it doesn't work. And so one semester I had this student who made the remark, Mr. Jones is terrible with technology, but he's still willing to try. And I could have been offended, because it really wasn't that I'm terrible with technology. It was in that classroom, sometimes things didn't always work like they were supposed to. But I thought that was a valuable thing for them to see as future teachers, that you don't always have to be an expert in it, and sometimes it's not going to work. But as a future teacher, you have to be willing to try new things. So that was a joke with him, because actually when he's student taught, he found out it's not always that the teacher is terrible with technology. He found like, well, it worked yesterday, but it didn't work today. So we laughed about that a lot. So I'll stop sharing, and we've got a few minutes if people have questions.